Everybody, I need to tell you about something that happened on March 28th, 2025, at 6:20 in the morning UTC, in the country of Myanmar. Something that the world briefly noticed, and then moved on from, because Myanmar is far away, and the news cycle never stops. And a disaster in a country most people couldn't point to on a map gets a few days of coverage and then disappears. But what happened in Myanmar that morning is now confirmed by multiple peer-reviewed papers published in Science, Nature Geoscience, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences to be something that has never happened before in the history of human seismological observation. The longest continental strike-slip fault rupture ever recorded on Earth. A magnitude 7 earthquake that ruptured 475 to 510 kilometers of the Sagaing Fault from Mandalay south toward Naypyidaw at super shear velocity. Faster than the speed of seismic shear waves. Faster than the earthquake's own energy should have allowed it to travel. 1.5 to 4.5 times longer than existing scientific models predicted was possible for a magnitude 7. And it exposed 6 million people to violent or extreme shaking in cities that had no idea that their local fault was capable of this. But that is not the story I need to tell you today. Because you can read the seismology in journals. What I need to tell you about today is the bigger question that the earthquake community has been quietly asking since this rupture was analyzed. The question that connects a 5-10 kilometer earthquake rupture on the Sagaing Fault in Myanmar to a Super El Niño that is now tracking toward the strongest event in recorded history. And that question is this: can a climate event trigger an earthquake? Can the flood and drought cycles driven by El Niño load and unload the ground surface enough to change the stress on major fault systems? Can the weight of monsoon flooding add just enough pore pressure to a locked fault to push it past the threshold it was already approaching? Scientists are debating that question right now. And the timing of the Myanmar earthquake, arriving during the tail end of the 2024 La Niña cycle at the onset of the 2026 El Niño buildup, has given that debate new urgency. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Mark here. No hype, no drama, just what you need to know. Let's get right into it. At 6:20 a.m. UTC, a magnitude 7 earthquake ruptured the central and southern Sagaing Fault. The Sagaing Fault is a 100 kilometer long right lateral strike-slip fault running north to south through the center of Myanmar. It is a plate boundary, the boundary between the Indian plate and the Sunda plate, and it moves at approximately 2 centimeters per year. Slow, steady, accumulating stress for decades between major ruptures. The last time the central section of the Sagaing Fault ruptured was 1839, 186 years of accumulated slip deficit. At 2 centimeters per year, that works out to approximately 3. 7 meters of accumulated displacement that had not been released since the reign of Queen Victoria had barely begun. All of that stored energy was waiting. And on March 28th, 2025, it released all at once. In a rupture that scientists described in the journal Science as more than twice the length predicted by magnitude scaling relationships. Those relationships that the mathematical models seismologists use to predict how far a fault will rupture for a given earthquake magnitude. Set a magnitude 7 should rupture somewhere between 100 and 300 kilometers. The Myanmar earthquake ruptured 475 to 510 kilometers. The upper end is 1, 7 to 4, 7 times longer than predicted. This is not a small discrepancy. This is science's fundamental relationship between earthquake magnitude and fault rupture length, failing by a factor of between 1, 6, and 4. 7, and multiple independent research teams using satellite SAR imagery, back projection of seismic waveforms, GPS geodesy, optical satellite observations, and field surveys all confirmed the same result. The rupture was real, the length was real, and the speed was something seismologists had rarely documented before. The earthquake ruptured at super shear velocity, speeds exceeding 5 kilometers per second, faster than the shear wave velocity of the surrounding crust. Seismologists confirmed the presence of a Rayleigh-Mach wave that passed through parts of Thailand, the seismic equivalent of a sonic boom generated when a rupture front exceeds the local wave velocity. This is the signature of super shear propagation, and it meant that the seismic energy arrived at communities along the fault faster than conventional seismological models would have predicted, before any warning system could have activated, before the first waves from the earthquake's origin point had even finished passing. The maximum surface displacement was 4 to 5 meters along the fault near Mandalay. The fault physically moved 4 to 5 meters horizontally in a matter of seconds. In the field, surveyors documented maximum displacement of 5 meters near Naypyidaw. The peak ground acceleration recorded at station NPW, located just 2 to 75 kilometers from the fault, was 0.62 g. That is ground motion intense enough to topple poorly constructed buildings, collapse bridges, and kill people who had no time to take any protective action. As of April 8, 2025, more than 3,645 people had been confirmed killed, more than 4,916 injured. Those numbers, as is always the case in Myanmar where reporting infrastructure is limited, are likely undercounts. The cities of Sagaing, Mandalay, and Naypyi Dao, three of Myanmar's most important population centers, were all within the rupture zone. Naypyi Dao is Myanmar's capital city, purpose-built in the 2000s on terrain that sits directly above the Sagaing Fault's southern rupture zone. The fault that ruptured 510 kilometers on March 28th runs directly through the capital of Myanmar. Under normal conditions, when a fault ruptures, the break propagates along the fault at a speed that is slower than the S-wave velocity of the surrounding rock, the speed at which shear seismic waves travel through crust, typically 3 to 4 kilometers per second. The rupture is, in effect, chasing its own seismic waves, and that means the waves arrive at any given point along the fault before the rupture front itself gets there, giving the ground at that location a brief moment of preliminary shaking before the most violent near-fault motion arrives. But when a rupture exceeds the S-wave velocity, when it goes super shear, it outruns its own energy waves on the fault perpendicular directions. The violent near-fault motion arrives without preliminary warning. Communities perpendicular to the fault, those sitting to the east and west of the Sagaing Fault's southern segments, experienced essentially simultaneous onset of violent shaking with no precursory tremor, no rumble before the violence, just the full force of a super shear rupture front arriving without any warning at all. A USGS paper published in Science described it precisely. The anomalous length exposed a vast population to violent near-fault shaking, and they drew a direct comparison that every American seismologist found deeply sobering. The Mandalay earthquake is a modern analog for the magnitude 7, 9, 1906 San Francisco earthquake, another atypically long and fast rupture. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake ruptured approximately 470 kilometers of the San Andreas Fault. It killed between 3,000 and 6,000 people. It is the most damaging earthquake in American history. And the 2025 Myanmar earthquake produced a rupture of comparable length on a fault that had accumulated comparable stress over a comparable repose interval. The comparison to San Francisco 1906 is not made lightly. It is made because the physics, the super shear velocity, the anomalous rupture length, the geometry of the mature strike-slip fault system are directly comparable. And the USGS paper noted something that every seismologist working on the San Andreas, the Hayward, and the other major California fault systems needed to read. Probabilistic seismic hazard analyses use scaling relations that do not account for such long ruptures at moderate magnitudes. The scientific models that California and other seismically active regions use to estimate earthquake risk were built on scaling relations that the Myanmar earthquake just proved can be violated by a factor of up to 4. 7. The hazard models are wrong in a systematic way that underestimates the possible rupture length, and therefore the possible damage area, for major strike-slip earthquakes. The direct specific claim that the 2026 Super El Niño triggered the 2025 Myanmar earthquake is not established scientific consensus. I want to be clear about that. The Sagaing Fault rupture on March 28, 2025 was primarily caused by the accumulation of 186 years of tectonic stress at approximately 2 centimeters per year of plate motion. The fault was going to rupture. The seismic gap between Mandalay and Naypyi Dao had been identified by scientists as a zone of high hazard. As recently as 2014, a study specifically identified the central Sagaing Fault gap as a likely source of a future major earthquake. The tectonic driver was always there, but the climate seismology connection is real, scientifically documented, and increasingly relevant in a world of amplifying climate extremes. And here is the mechanism. El Nino, and particularly the large-scale drought and flood cycles it drives across Asia, changes the distribution of water on the surface of the Earth. During strong El Nino events, the Indian and Southeast Asian monsoon is weakened, groundwater levels drop across broad regions as rainfall decreases, surface reservoirs hold less water, river levels fall, and when large masses of water are removed from the land surface, through drought, the weight pressing down on the underlying crust decreases. This is called surface unloading. And when a surface load is removed from above a locked fault, the effect on the fault is measurable. The vertical stress on the fault decreases slightly. The fault becomes slightly less compressed. And in certain fault geometries and orientations, that slight reduction in confining stress can reduce the friction that is keeping the fault locked, nudging it incrementally closer to the failure threshold. This effect is small, tiny in absolute terms, fractions of a kilopascal in most cases, but fault systems that are already critically stressed, already at the edge of their failure threshold, can be influenced by surprisingly small perturbations. Scientists have documented earthquake rate changes associated with seasonal groundwater loading and unloading in multiple active fault regions worldwide. The research group led by Christopher Milliner at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory published a study in 2020 demonstrating that seasonal groundwater changes in California correlate with detectable changes in the rate of small earthquakes on the San Andreas system. The amplitude of the stress perturbation from seasonal groundwater was tiny, on the order of kilopascals, but its statistical fingerprint in the earthquake catalog was detectable, and in Myanmar specifically, a region where the monsoon-driven groundwater cycle is among the most pronounced on Earth. The pattern of El Niño-induced drought, removing surface water loads from above the Sagaing fault system, is a plausible, physically motivated mechanism for incrementally nudging a critically stressed fault toward failure. The 2026 El Niño has been building since the summer of 2025. Its atmospheric and oceanic signals were already detectable in early 2025. And the drought patterns associated with the developing El Niño over Southeast Asia, the weakened monsoon, the reduced groundwater recharge, were already expressing themselves across Myanmar and the broader Indochina region in the months preceding the March 28th earthquake. Does that mean El Niño caused the Myanmar earthquake? No. The fault was going to rupture regardless. The 186 years of accumulated tectonic stress was the overwhelming driver. El Niño could not have created that rupture from a fault at rest. But did the climate signal, the surface unloading, the groundwater decline, the reduction in confining stress, contribute a small increment of perturbation to a fault that was already critically stressed and already primed for failure? Scientists are actively researching that question, and the developing consensus is that climate tectonic interactions are real, measurable, and increasingly important to understand as climate extremes become more frequent and more severe. The scaling relations that every seismic hazard model uses, the mathematical equations that translate earthquake magnitude into expected rupture length, rupture area, and ground motion intensity have just been shown to be systematically wrong for mature, geometrically simple strike-slip faults. The Myanmar fault is smooth, straight, simple in its geometry, mature in the sense that it has been active for millions of years and has been polished by repeated slip into an efficient rupture highway. And precisely because of those characteristics shared by portions of the San Andreas Fault, the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey, the Altyn-Tag Fault in China, and other major strike-slip systems worldwide, it was capable of a rupture 1. 6-4, 7 times longer than the standard models predicted. The Hayward Fault in California, running through Oakland, Berkeley, Fremont, and Hayward, with a 72% probability of a magnitude 6, 7 or greater earthquake in the next 30 years, is a mature, geometrically simple strike-slip fault. The southern San Andreas Fault from the Salton Sea through Palm Springs is a mature, geometrically simple strike-slip fault. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake demonstrated that the northern San Andreas is capable of exactly the kind of anomalously long supershear rupture that Myanmar just produced. These are not abstract hazard discussions. These are fault systems that run through the most densely populated, most economically productive regions of the United States. And the seismic hazard models used to design California's buildings, its bridges, its dams, its emergency response systems, those models use scaling relations that the Myanmar earthquake just demonstrated are potentially wrong by a factor of up to 4. 7 for the specific fault type that California's most dangerous faults belong to. The USGS paper in Science said it directly. The earthquake's anomalous length revealed unaccounted risk. Probabilistic seismic hazard analyses do not account for such long ruptures at moderate magnitudes. That statement from the USGS, published in Science, means that the hazard assessments used to design critical infrastructure in California, Washington, Oregon, and every other state with mature strike-slip fault systems are potentially underestimating the ground motion exposure from a future major earthquake. This is not a small scientific footnote. This is a fundamental revision of how we need to think about earthquake risk. Zeke Housefather of Berkeley. Earth said the current El Niño is on track to surpass the previous record holder by a mind-blowing margin. Justin Mankin of Dartmouth warned the event could cause $10 trillion in economic losses by 2032 through its effects on food security, infrastructure, and global supply chains. The Union of Concerned Scientists confirmed that nearly every seasonal forecast model is predicting an unprecedented El Niño event with roughly a 90% chance of it becoming the strongest in recorded history. What does that mean for global fault systems? It means the drought patterns across Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Africa, and the Western Americas that are associated with strong El Niño events are going to be more pronounced, longer lasting, and more geographically extensive than any previous El Niño has produced. It means the surface unloading from groundwater depletion is going to be larger, the changes in pore pressure on fault systems are going to be larger, and the critically stressed fault systems that were already approaching their failure thresholds, the ones that accumulated their stress decades or centuries before any El Niño signal arrived, are going to be receiving incremental perturbations from climate-driven surface processes at a level that has no historical precedent. This does not mean the Super El Niño is going to trigger a wave of major earthquakes. That is not the science. The science says that critically stressed faults are sensitive to small perturbations, and that climate-driven surface loading and unloading is one source of those small perturbations, and that the scale of those perturbations is proportional to the severity of the climate signal. A record-shattering Super El Niño delivers a record-scale climate signal, and the Earth science community is watching how that signal interacts with fault systems that, in many cases, have been accumulating tectonic stress for far longer than any instrument has been measuring them. Myanmar's San Andreas Fault had not ruptured in 186 years. Its rupture was the longest continental strike-slip rupture in recorded history, and it occurred in the opening phase of the developing Super El Niño. That connection is real. That timing is real. Whether it is causal, coincidental, or somewhere on the spectrum between those two extremes is what the science is still working to determine. And that is the honest answer that every person watching this deserves to hear. The Myanmar earthquake, March 28, 2025. Magnitude 7. 7. Ruptured 475 to 510 kilometers of the central and southern San Andreas Fault, the longest continental strike-slip rupture ever recorded. Between 1, 6, and 4. 7 times longer than standard magnitude to rupture length scaling relations predicted. Rupture velocity exceeded the S-wave speed of the crust, confirmed by the Rayleigh Mach wave detected in Thailand. Surface displacement of 4 to 5 meters along the fault. Peak ground acceleration of 0, 62 Gr at a station 2. 75 kilometers from the fault, 6 million people exposed to violent or extreme shaking in Sagaing, Mandalay, and Naypyidaw. At least 3,645 confirmed dead as of April 8, 2025. The scaling relations used in all probabilistic seismic hazard analyses do not account for such anomalously long ruptures at moderate magnitudes. The hazard models are systematically underestimating possible rupture lengths, and therefore possible damage areas, for major mature strike-slip faults worldwide, including in California. The El Niño connection, physically motivated, scientifically debated, not established as direct causation, but scientifically plausible as a contributing perturbation. Climate-driven surface loading and unloading from drought and flood cycles changes pore pressure and confining stress on fault systems at a measurable level. The developing Super El Niño is on track to deliver the largest climate signal in recorded history across the same regions, Southeast Asia, South Asia, where major locked fault systems sit. Scientists are actively studying whether and how these signals interact. The bottom line, the Myanmar earthquake revealed that our fundamental models for earthquake hazard are wrong in a systematic way. And the Super El Niño building right now is the largest climate perturbation those same fault systems have ever been subjected to. Watch, study, prepare. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for your extraordinary support. And before I go, a quick word from our Father. Amos 4:13. For behold, he who forms mountains and creates the wind and declares to man what is his thought, who makes the morning darkness and treads on the heights of the earth. The Lord, the God of hosts, is his name. Everybody, he forms the mountains. He creates the winds. He declares his thoughts to those who will listen. The Sagaing Fault moved 5 meters in seconds on March 28, 2025. The El Niño is changing the pressure on every fault system beneath every drought-stricken landscape on this earth. And he knew every one of those movements before a single seismograph was ever installed. All glory always goes to God, our Father in heaven, Yahweh. I pray he protects the people of Myanmar in their ongoing recovery, gives wisdom to the scientists studying the climate seismology connection, and keeps every single one of you safe from every earthquake this planet still has ahead. Amen. Hallelujah. Amen. Stay safe, everybody. Stay informed, and I will see you in the next update.